For those of you who weren't here, I'm Jeff Cohen. I'm a director in FSG Seattle office. I do a lot of collective impact work. I do a lot of work that isn't collective impact, but that's place-based. And I do a lot of work in Texas. And so I'm currently working on a collective impact initiative on healthcare in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. Previously did one on education, but I also do strategic planning for foundations and lots of other work. And then I want to introduce Admas, or have Admas introduce herself.
Oh, sure. For those of you who aren't here this morning, my name is Admas Kanyakia. I'm an associate director in the San Francisco office. I've been with FSG for about 1.5 years, but I definitely come from the community in terms of doing this type of work around cross-sector collaborations in the arenas of affordable housing and homelessness. So very excited to be here today.
And I want to share a little bit about FSG, mainly so you know the point of view and the perspective at which we come at this work from. So we're a nonprofit strategy and evaluation firm. We do quite a bit of research and publication as well. We're founded about 13 years ago by a Harvard Business School professor, Michael Porter, and our CEO, Mark Kramer. We work with all different kinds of organizations. We started out working mainly with foundations, but now work with foundations, nonprofits, government agencies, corporations. As part of our nonprofit mission, we invest a lot in research and in publication and in increasingly trying to build the field and trying to build communities of practice around different ideas as well, collective impact being one of them. And that's really how we came to the collective impact work. One of the things we are always doing is we work across the country and around the world, and we're trying to look across practices and see what's bubbling up, see what's interesting, and ask ourselves, can we document that? Can we give that a platform so that other people can, maybe see those good ideas and learn from them? And so a few years, probably 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, we saw collective impact efforts happening in different places throughout the country and said, wow, some of those seem to be really successful. Some of those seem, that seems like a really interesting approach. Can we dig into it and identify in the most successful efforts what are the things that seem to be key to making them successful? And so published a series of articles of that. And since that time, we've also been working on the ground. And so we've continued to try to make sure that what we're seeing out in the field is informing what we're putting out there. And also we now have a community of practice where we've invited everybody who's doing this work to come and talk about it and talk with each other. So hopefully that will surface even more good ideas and move progress on it even more quickly. So I want to start with a quick definition of it and how it's different, how collective impact is differentiated from other kinds of collaboration. Because there has been collaboration going on for a long time, and there are lots of different and quite successful collaborations that aren't collective impact. So some of the, try to list those there, and I think one way that collective impact is differentiated is that it is cross-sector. So ideally you have stakeholders, all the stakeholders who touch a problem, be they government, be they nonprofit, be they philanthropic, be they corporate. You want everybody at the table. Another way in which it's differentiated is that it is all the relevant stakeholders. So it's not just a subset, but everybody who touches on an issue. It's a collaboration that's focused on a specific issue. So it's not open-ended. It's not an affinity group. It's not a collaboration by type, like a funder collaborative. It's really the relevant organizations to focus on a particular issue in generally a particular place. And then finally, it's long-term but not completely open-ended. So you have a goal, you have an issue that you're trying to make progress on, but you also have something of a timeline, 10 years, 15 years, rather than, well, we'll just keep talking as long as we're all around. So I think those things help to give it focus. And that really leads to the way we define it, which you can see up there at the top. Long-term commitment by a group of important actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem. So within that, what we think and what we see as the key elements to efforts that have really had a lot of traction, that have really made progress, we see that there are 5 key elements. And so the first being a common agenda. And that is a common understanding of the problem, a common language for talking about the problem, making sure that the terms you're using, everybody's mutually agreed on what they mean. a shared vision for change. So likewise, a common sense of where do you want to go? Where would you like to see progress on this issue in 10 years? Coming out of that, once that common agenda is established, you can talk about a shared measurement system. Once you have the goals, you can say, okay, well, how are we going to measure whether we're getting there? How are we going to track our progress? And so that leads to agreeing on a set of metrics, having some kind of capacity to collect data, cultivating a sense of shared accountability, and really, I think, ultimately thinking about this also as a fundamental piece of the way that the initiative can learn. Differentiated but mutually reinforcing activities. This means that all the folks who are involved in the initiative continue to do their important work in the community, continue to be providing services, whatever it is they're doing. But there is some coordination, there's some willingness to adapt, to address gaps as they're identified. We could talk more about this and what specifically means. I think it's a little hard at a very high level. But it essentially means it's not pulling everybody off course. It's not displacing all the work that everybody's already doing. Collective impact is really an attempt to just create more alignment and coordination and make sure that key gaps are addressed. Continuous communication, efforts that are effective, that have a lot of momentum. There's a lot of talking among partner organizations. There's a lot of talking among the community and the backbone. There's just a lot of communication going on, both within the effort and also with folks who are not necessarily deeply engaged with the effort, but who are affected by it, people who are in the community. And so some of that is meetings, some of that is communicating about metrics and how progress is going. Some of that is continuous learning and figuring out who to engage in that. So lots of elements to that also we can talk more about. And then finally and critically, dedicated backbone support. So some kind of dedicated capacity to help support all of these other activities. And we'll talk a lot about that, and that's really what you all are doing in your roles. And so it's key that there's dedicated capacity. It's also, there are certain functions and roles that the backbone has to play, and there are certain capabilities that the backbone needs in order to play those roles. So talk about that in a fair amount of detail today. So for those of you who've done this work, you probably are familiar, there's an arc to it. You have an initial phase, and I think there are a number of different components. You can break this down into governance and infrastructure, strategic planning, community involvement, and evaluation. And you've got an initial phase where you're just getting the group together. You're kind of getting trust built, you're getting relationships established, you're starting to establish what the rules are for how the group interacts. In this initial phase, you're also gathering data and figuring out, okay, within this general issue, what are the key points seem to be where we could really make change, or what are the really glaring areas where our community is having challenges. And you can use that data both to make the case, but also it starts to move towards informing what that common agenda will look like. And then you are also at the same time trying to make the community aware, trying to go out in the community and identify potential steering committee members. So really making people aware that's going on and trying to get them excited about it and thinking about how you can engage different folks. Phase 2, which is the phase that FSG is often involved with on the ground, is the period from when essentially getting a steering committee set up to when a backbone is established. So in this phase, you're really creating that infrastructure, you're choosing the backbone, you're getting the backbone staffed up. The steering committee is formed and is creating a common agenda with a set of goals and a set of strategies. From that set of goals and set of strategies, you're getting to the set of shared metrics, as well as the metrics for the strategies and the work groups, and you're figuring out, okay, what is the capacity going to be to keep that, to be tracking those metrics, to be interpreting those metrics, to be reporting out on those metrics, and again, continuing to engage the community, bringing community members onto the steering committee, making folks who are not deeply involved with the steering committee or the work groups, keeping them aware of the work that's going on. And then finally, the end of this phase is really marked by what I would say the backbone is set up, the backbone is staffed, the backbone is sort of on its way, and then you're in the mode of sustaining this action and sustaining the impact. And so you're using the data that you're collecting to facilitate and refine the strategy. The backbone is helping to support the implementation of the strategy. It's helping to support partner organizations. And again, continued community engagement. And maybe, not every backbone does this, but that can lead into, are there issues that it makes sense to do some advocacy on? Are there particular things we're seeing emerging in the community that are obstacles to progress that if we mobilize as a community, we could change at a policy level?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Regarding the strategic planning, how often do you suggest it be updated?
It's a great question. I think that the common agenda is really formulated once, at the beginning, but as data comes in and as progress is made, you probably want to revisit it and ask questions about it. I think once a year, unless things are really changing rapidly. But I do think it does make sense to rethink the common agenda, to look at the particular strategies every year, maybe every 2 years. I think they could vary, but some regular interval, because the whole idea is that you're collecting that data so that you can see what's changing in the landscape and so that you can respond to those changes. But you also don't want to be changing strategies every 3 months. I know some organizations that do that, but it's not super effective, I don't think. So the timing for these different phases can change. We've seen it vary quite a bit. That initial phase of just getting folks together and getting the baseline data can be, generally around 6 months. That organizing for impact of getting the backbone set up, getting the steering committee going, getting the common agenda chosen, that can range anywhere from 6 to 18 months. And then sustaining action goes on for as long as the group, as long as the issue is there to be dealt with, or you can keep the group together. So this isn't meant to be normative. Just people. We found a lot of people ask, well, what's the general timeline? I think this is a little bit more of what tends to be happening at those in that timeline. So with that initiate action 6-month timeline, you often see getting the data together and making the cases in the first 3 months. You're identifying and recruiting a steering committee after that. You're developing a common agenda and thinking about what the quick wins might be. And all along this timeline, you're conducting outreach to stakeholders. And then you kind of go down to here, the second phase of organizing for impact. Again, a lot of it ends up being about the backbone. You continue to develop the common agenda. You're creating work groups and you're developing strategy level shared measurements. Once the backbone's up and running, you're developing a shared measurement system. So this is, schematic, but these are the activities that are generally happening along those timelines. This is really, a key slide. It's an attempt to show what the structure of a collective impact initiative is, and it features kind of the critical importance of the backbone. So up at the top on the left, you've got the steering committee. Those colored boxes are meant to represent the fact that the steering committee is composed of partner organizations, community members. It's really the community in a form that can govern the work. And so the steering committee is determining the common agenda, determining the shared measurements, really setting strategy. And then you've got the backbone there, which is coordinating all that work that's happening on the strategies and the working groups, helping to support the partners and connect partners with each other, helping to do the community engagement. So the backbone is really executing the strategy and also supporting the steering committee and making sure that they're seeing data, that they're coming back at regular intervals and thinking about, does this strategy still make sense? Does this activity still make sense? So the backbone is really the key support structure in the whole thing, but the backbone is not setting the agenda. And we can come back and talk about this in more detail as well. Backbones really provide 6 key functions. The guiding vision and strategy once it's set. So, helping to make sure that everybody understands it, helping to the work groups translate it into their own strategies, supporting the aligned activities, and there's a lot that goes on under that. There's the coordinating and facilitating, the convening, and all the building the agenda for those convenings, bringing in the right data and the right materials for those meetings. Backbones often provide technical assistance in various ways, sometimes around data, sometimes on other things, helping to recruit new partners into the effort as needed. And I think another piece of this is looking across everything that's happening and finding opportunities for alignment, finding opportunities to create connections between organizations that would benefit from talking to each other. Oh, Organization X is doing this, Organization Y is doing that, that's pretty similar, let's get them together. So it's not just about the whole group, it's also about particular organizations or particular efforts that are going on within the overall initiative that can be connected. So it's not always convening the whole steering committee or connecting the steering committee, it's about creating that infrastructure and thickening that web of connections where it sees opportunities to do so. Establishing shared measurement practices. So this is really once the shared measurement metrics have been set, the backbone plays an important role in collecting that data, analyzing that data, interpreting it, and reporting out on it. Also bringing it, making sure that it's being looked at, so making sure that there's time set aside for the steering committee, for the work groups to look at that data and think about it and think about its implications for the work. Providing technical assistance for data capacity. And the key there is that one of the key components of backbone organizations is this data management function. Building public will, the backbone can, because it has all the data, because it's bringing together all the partners, is really in a good position to create a sense of urgency around the issue and to help articulate a call to action. Certainly doing community engagement, and then the producing and managing external communication. So an example of that is a lot of backbones produce a yearly report, which is based on the 15 or 20 key metrics, and they communicate out to the community. Here's how we're doing. Here's what's gone up. Here's what's gone down. Here's what we're thinking about that. So they would do that as part of the building public will function. The fifth one is optional. Not all backbones do this. But again, backbones are in a good position to identify a policy and advocacy agenda because they're looking across all the activities. They're seeing where there are challenges that are coming from policies or regulatory issues or things that institutional issues where mobilizing the entire community to change a rule could be effective. And so again, depends on the community, depends on the comfort of the backbone, depends on what's needed. So, but they're certainly in a good position to do that if they want to. And then finally, mobilizing additional funding. Backbones have the capacity to help communities go after federal grants, to pursue funding from national philanthropic sources. So there are things that can be done with that backbone capacity that actually bring in additional incremental money to the effort that it would be quite hard for individual organizations to do by themselves. And an example of that is work in South Seattle around improving post-secondary attainment. The Roadmap Project got that whole region together to apply for a Race to the Top grant and got $40 million. That the capacity would not have been there without them to get that money, and then that money went. Another good point is that the money did not go to the backbone. That money went to the school districts and to the organizations that were doing the work in the community, but the backbone helped bring that money in. It is interesting, it's not always easy to see what the backbone is doing, and so people often describe it with a metaphor. So you've got up there, they're the quarterback. So, they've got somebody's giving them the plan, but they're helping to arrange the players on the field and coordinate things. This is a great point, I think, the second quote, where there are a lot of events with people who don't understand what the backbones do, in part because they're doing it behind the scenes, and it's important for backbones to do it behind the scenes. I think we've seen in the efforts that work really well, the backbone isn't out in front, highly visible, taking credit. The backbone is behind the scenes, elevating the work, elevating organizations that are doing the work, and really trying to help everybody get more visibility and bring visibility to the issue and to the progress rather than to the backbone organization itself. They're an umbrella that can say, this is a challenge, let's address it together. They're a bridge between different types of stakeholders in different sectors. So people do seem to use metaphors, and I think some of those are a good way to get at the nature of the work, which is pretty interstitial and somewhat behind the scenes. Spent a little bit of time on this one, and maybe a little bit more than we did on the last session. It's a unique skill set to be able to do this, and it's some things that are hard to find together. So you need a high level of credibility in the community. The backbone needs to be seen as neutral. The backbone has to be respected. You have to have dedicated staff. The backbone has to be a good relationship builder. So there have to be people in the backbone who know the community, who are able to bring people together and connect them to each other. At the same time, the backbone also has to be able to create a sense of urgency and focus people's attention on an issue. The backbone has to be able to frame issues well so that people who are in different sectors can understand them from their point of view. It's really helpful if the backbone has an orientation to use evaluation and use data as a tool for learning. And that's, not everybody knows how to do that or is familiar with how that works. So bringing people together over data, not as a stick, we didn't make our goals, but really, we did really well here, we didn't do so well here, let's dig into that and try to understand what went on underneath that. So another metaphor that I've heard for that is using data as a flashlight to sort of look at, examine things and see what's going on, rather than as a cudgel. Backbone's ensuring coordination and accountability, and this may be the hardest of all, given all these other things that the backbone needs to be able to do. The backbone needs to be able to stay behind the scenes so that there's collective ownership. And so there's a little bit of needing to be egoless that can be challenging. But we have certainly seen backbones that have most of these characteristics. But it's a very, it's a high bar. There's a lot of capabilities that you need. Some common misperceptions about what the backbone does. And we see this a lot in initiatives that are getting started. There's a nonprofit organization that comes forward that really cares about an issue and that wants to be in the lead on the issue, and they think a good way to do that is to be a backbone organization. And in general, it's probably not really the best way for them to be involved, because the backbone is not really supposed to be highly visible. And the backbone doesn't set the agenda. The steering committee sets the agenda, and the idea is that the steering committee sets it because the steering committee is representative of the community as a whole. It's not one organization. It's meant to get the voices of everybody to determine the agenda. The backbone support organization does not drive the solutions. Those solutions are developed in working groups. They're developed by partner organizations. They're developed out in the community, and the backbone's trying to find them and make people aware of them and connect people and support the implementation of solutions, but it's not coming up with them and then driving them out into the community. The idea that the backbone support organization receives all the funding, which is definitely not true, as most backbones will tell you. And really, backbones need a certain amount of funding to operate, but anything above that, they really ought to be helping bring in additional funding. They ought to be helping make sure that whatever funding they do bring in is going out to the work and to the partners in the community. So it's not necessarily going to be a great fiscal move as a nonprofit to be a backbone because you're going to get all this additional funding. That's not how it generally works. This idea that a backbone can be self-appointed rather than selected by the community. We really find that the backbones that work best are ones that are, there's different kinds of ways you can do the process, but that there's some selection process, whether it's through the steering committee or some other way, that the community is selecting that backbone. If a backbone self-appoints, a lot of other stakeholders in the community will say, well, that's their project. That we're not part of it. They have appointed themselves as the lead on it. There hasn't been a collective determination of who should be supporting it. So it doesn't really work out that well. We've seen it happen, and you generally do find other key players say, and I'm not going to get too involved. And then finally, that you can have a backbone that's just business as usual. It doesn't require more staffing time or resources to perform these functions. That somebody can do it off the side of their desk. That you can put it on an organization that already has a pretty busy day job, or a person that already has a pretty busy day job, without adding a lot of resources. And the truth of the matter is, you can try and it might work. But there's a lot of work to be done, and what happens if it's not a full-time job, if there's not a dedicated resource, this stuff just doesn't happen. All that work that needs to happen, nobody, they say, well, I didn't get to it, and there's not much you can do then. That said, given that there is dedicated capacity, that dedicated capacity can take a lot of different forms. So this is not my ideal order, actually, because I think funder-based can be done, but it's tricky. So it can be based in a funder. There are some power dynamics there that are hard to navigate when the funder is also a backbone, because the backbone needs to be seen as neutral. People need to be able to talk pretty frankly to it, and some funders can pull that off, and others can't. But that's one thing. That's certainly a form we've seen. I'd say the two most common are either a new nonprofit created to be the backbone, or an existing nonprofit that adds capacity to take on the function. Again, the pros are, of a new nonprofit is they can be neutral. It doesn't have a lot of baggage. The cons are it doesn't necessarily have sustainable sources of funding. With an existing nonprofit, they may be more sustainable and established, but there may be tricky political issues. So there's pros and cons to all of these, but those are pretty common forms. It can often be in a government institution. So we're the New York Juvenile Justice effort that we were involved in. There's an entity at the state level that's in the governor's office that runs that. The nice thing about that is there's definitely funding, as long as the administration doesn't change. But there's funding available. And then we've seen it shared across multiple organizations. We've seen it steering committee driven. Again, my sense of this is that those are a little less ideal, because it's just harder to the shared across multiple organizations is a little harder to sort out, and there's a coordination cost when more than one organization is doing that work. And then steering committee driven, it depends on the steering committee having capacity to do the work, which not even if they do now, will they in a year? I don't know. But these are all forms that we've seen. I'd say some work better than others. But
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
Whenever you see the steering committee or the shared across, they seem very similar to me. Do they frequently have a dedicated staff person kind of off to the side that kind of helps organize that multiple organization meetings or steering committees?
So I think for shared across, there's capacity in both organizations, or three, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So there is dedicated capacity in those organizations. It's just the issue there is more getting that coordinated. So now you've got another layer of coordination because you've got two backbones or more. With steering committee driven, you can have a person, a support person, but the idea is that the tricky thing about that is, I think it generally is a little bit under powered, because you don't have a full. The idea is that some of the steering committee is doing the work, and so if that person is just a support person, and so it's probably, I just don't think you don't generally get a full blown set of capacity that you need. And again, in Memphis Fast Forward, they may have that, but I think as a form, the temptation is to say, oh, we're just going to divide up the roles or the functions among the folks on the steering committee, and then you're back to the original situation of people have full-time jobs, and they just don't happen. And then if you go to add in capacity, well, then why not just go to put it in an existing nonprofit or go to a new nonprofit? It seems a little bit challenging to me, but backbones really, this is to me less about staff positions than it is about the key functions of a backbone. So the leadership function, and that function is really about engaging people, connecting people, managing the relationships, making sure people stay engaged, creating that sense of urgency around the issue. The data management function where the shared measurement system really needs some kind of dedicated capacity to collect the data, to interpret the data, to share out the data, and then the facilitation capacity. There are lots of meetings, and so somebody needs to be good at running those meetings, figuring out the agenda for those meetings, knowing how to make those meetings productive. So those can be 3 different people. They don't have to be, but those are, I think, the 3 key functions at a minimum that a backbone needs to do its work. This we put in, I think, because sometimes we get questions about, well, what would a backbone budget look like? I mean, and I would caveat this heavily. I think every community and every issue will have a different budget. This is from Strive, and it's meant to be, I think, an average backbone at a year in with a pretty, probably in a decent, pretty sizable place, and it sounds high, but if you've got 3.5 FTEs there, and you've got benefits, and you've got, you end up at about $400,000 a year. But again, I always say to people, you can do it for a lot less than this too. But this is just I think it also does make the point, it's not nothing, that it does cost something. This is a little bit more granular on what exactly does the backbone do day to day. What is the day-to-day work? And I think we really see that there's 5 big areas where you come in on a Monday as a backbone staff member. What are the things you're thinking about? Well, you're thinking about the steering committee and when's the next meeting, what needs to be on the agenda, what are the materials needed to support that agenda, how are we going to facilitate that meeting, how do we support the co-chairs, how do you manage that? There's usually, so there's a piece around managing the steering committee and making sure that its work can happen. There's this data collection function, or data management function on shared measurement, which I already talked quite a bit about, but that's daily work. There's always new data coming in, there's always a need to be interpreting that, and if something's showing up, to be sharing it with the steering committee, to be sharing it with the community, and also to be supporting partners in building their capacity. It can be another piece of that. There's the working group support. So those are the groups that are implementing the strategies, and so they're also having meetings, and they need support on that and setting agendas and preparing material. They sometimes need additional research done. You're trying to connect them to the community. You're trying to help them interact with the steering committee and help them report up to the steering committee. How are things going on a particular strategy? How's that working group going? There's the external communications piece. So the big one here, I think, major progress reports, annual report outs to the community, anything that's happening, any major initiatives, any big grants that come in, any major programs that are being launched, you'd want to communicate that out. So my sense is this takes a little bit less time than these other 3, which are really the core work. And then there's just administrative support across all of that. And I'd be interested to hear, if that corresponds with, those of you who are doing this work. Does that seem like what you're doing, or are we missing something? Yeah, we can come back to it. We're always trying to refine these based on what we hear. So, and there are different skill sets that go along with that. For the shared measurement, the steering committee leadership, and the working group support functions, you really need that strategy skill set to analyze information and get it into a form where it can be helpful in decision making, to recognize patterns across what's happening, to identify those gaps in areas where there could be more coordination. For these functions, for that external communication and engagement piece, for that steering committee leadership, and for the working group support, we have what we call the servant leadership orientation, where the idea is you're serving the community. It's not the backbone organization that's the lead. It's the backbone organization that's facilitating all of this. And the importance here, in particular, being seen as neutral and reflective and able to bring people together in a way that you're listening to them, you're connecting them. You're not putting an agenda out there or being highly directive about what other people should be doing. And then for external communication and engagement in the steering committee, again, community organizing mindset. So being able to be connected in the community, have relationships in the community, being able to bring new people in as things change, as things shift, being able to think, oh, we need so-and-so at the table now. Oh, we need these partners involved. So that sense that you always have to be connecting it to what's happening on the ground in the community and being aware of how that'll change and how that should change the composition of the steering committee, of the working groups. And then finally, equipping other people and giving them the tools they need to be effective. So, which requires kind of thinking about, okay, where is everybody? What are they supposed to be doing? Where are they trying to get? And how can the backbone support them? And what are the sort of things that they need to move forward? So again, it's a lot. It's a it's a lot to do. It's interesting, as you look across initiatives and we were talking about this at lunch, the challenges change according to the phase of the initiative. So the things that you need to do in phase 1, so in the first 6 months, are really, really different from the things you're doing in phase 3 years in, or even 6 years in. So and that's hard because the backbone organization generally stays the same. And it started with certain people, but as it evolves, you find, well, those capacities may not match up to what needs to be done anymore. And so people who get really excited, and this is like any organization, people who get really excited about getting something off the ground and bringing people together and sort of the early stages of a project, when you're in year 6, and it's more about how do we keep this going in the face of the fact that our initial funders kind of want to move on, and the people who were leading organizations when we started are now shifting out. How do we make sure that that's a very different kind of challenge, and different kind of people who are able to do that versus that. So as you're a backbone, how do you think about refreshing your capacity as you go through these different phases and this trajectory of growth? There's different backbones face different constraints in terms of the capacity of the people who are there. Some communities find it harder to find the skill sets or to find certain of the skill sets. Where do you house the backbone? Where does it actually do its work? Do you get in-kind space? Do you have to pay for space? Is it in a university? Is it in a government office? What does that mean for the politics? So it seems simple, but actually even just where the backbone has its offices is a fairly complex question. And then, as always, resources. So even if, ideally the backbone has a timeline when it starts of 2 or 3 years where there's funding lined up, well, after that, you need to have some idea of how is it going to be sustainable. You need a very different organization for an entire region than you do for a neighborhood. And so the scope of the Collective Impact Initiative really can determine what kind of backbone you're looking at, not just in terms of the resources available, but what kind of relationships you need to be effective in a big region is different than in a neighborhood. And so there are different challenges that arise with each of those. If you're in a 4-county area, how does the backbone bring together the right set of people, even though they're going to have a director of X in each of the 4 counties? You don't need all those people there, but it's a challenge to figure out how to manage that. And then finally, going back to the types of backbones, different organizational structures have different challenges. So if you're in, say, a United Way versus a funder, that creates, how do you negotiate those different roles? Because you're also, often accountable to that organization that's housing you. So there's things to think about there if there is a parent organization or if the backbone is embedded in some other nonprofit or foundation. I'll stop there. What this goes into next is really process metrics for the backbone, and then it starts to get into shared measurement and evaluation. But if there are comments or questions or thoughts, this is probably a good place to pause and have a conversation.
I'm looking at, you have a backbone, and you have about length of like 10 years, 15 years,
Yeah.
7 years.
Yeah.
Whereas the backbone would remain the constant, the working groups would be the ones that sort of change, sort of in and out, depending again on the data and what it says is needed. So there is a constant, there's expectation that there will be change.
There could be. I mean, there wouldn't necessarily be, but there could be. So you certainly would probably change the working groups more than you would shift the backbone, because that's a big, it'd be very hard to do that versus if you have 4 working groups, adjusting one or changing one or adding one isn't as big a challenge. So you're more able to change at that level. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on how the backbone would go about recruiting for the steering committee and forming the work groups?
So, the steering committee is usually formed before the backbone's in place. I mean, that's not a dogma, but often that's what we find. And so what you find is that initial group of champions who's interested in doing this, there's a little bit of you start with 3 or 4 or 5 people, and from there they identify some folks, and those people identify some folks. So it's forming that initial steering committee of 20 to 25 people is usually a bit of an organic process where the people who are most passionate about it think about who else needs to be at the table, and then you go through a process of trying to make sure that you're comprehensive. So though you ask that second tier of people, okay, well, who do you think needs to be at the table, and then you get a set of folks. So I'd say that, and then that steering committee creates the common agenda, and then you get the backbone in place generally. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Well, we can talk about measurement. It's interesting, we get a lot of questions about, well, how do you measure what the backbone's doing? I mean, you've got these long-term outcome metrics, you've got maybe quick wins, but how do you think about whether the backbone is doing its job? And really, what you end up with there is a set of more process-type metrics, and this is an example of what those could be. Everything from, are people coming to meetings? One of the backbone's jobs is to make sure the meetings are productive and make sure it's getting, so that, that's a pretty basic one. What are the number of partners committed to the work? What are the number of funders? That's not entirely within the backbone's control, but so there's some funding metrics you can think about. Policy changes are another later, you'd have to be somewhat well established in the work to start seeing that, but you can use some things like families reached or students kind of, traditional metrics of reach. Has the backbone met kind of internal organizational milestones? Does it have an executive director? Does it have office space? Is there a data analyst if that's part of its role? And then you can do things like surveys. Are the partner organizations satisfied with what the backbone's doing? That can be informal, that can be formal. So, just an example of how one might think about assessing how the backbone itself is doing. And then there's a longer set of these that I won't read to you, but we'll provide you with this presentation. And it's but this is interesting because it's aligned along the 6 functions. And so there's some suggested indicators that are lined up with the different functions.
Are these in your evaluation, like the 3-part evaluation framework guides? Are those in those documents somewhere, or are these sort of new?
No, actually, that is more about evaluating the collective impact initiative
Okay.
rather than the backbone. So
these
there's
are in a separate. And do you
yeah.
have
So I'm going
those-
to talk about that too.
Do you
But-
have those?
Yes.
Placed on your website that are available?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Or Adams?
No, I was just gonna say, we'll provide the presentation, and that way you can have. Some of the reading that we have talks about sort of backbone organizations. I don't know if it has a list of all the indicators, but
Yeah.
a lot of reading on backbone.
And again, I think the idea here was to be helpful to backbones in communicating, hey, this is all the stuff we're doing. This is all the stuff we have to do. This is how we're providing value. So to shift to the initiative level, there's this shared measurement piece, which we actually had a lot of conversation about in the grantee session. What is shared measurement? We think it's absolutely critical for how this works. It's a key engine to making this kind of initiative adaptive and able to deal with complex problems. And we would define it as identifying common metrics for tracking progress toward a common agenda across organizations and providing platforms to share data, discuss learnings, and improve strategy and action. And I'd emphasize improve. And, the idea is this is a key piece of basically a continuous improvement effort. You're learning as you go, and measuring and looking at data is a key piece of learning. Lots of benefits to this, actually. What we find is when communities start trying to do this, they realize, oh, we're interested in this, but actually the data we have is pretty bad. And so, the first step is for people to get together and say, okay, we need this data, and to go to the state agency or to go to whatever the organization can get it and say, we need X, Y, and Z, we need these cuts of it because we want to be measuring our progress on this, and we just don't have it in the form or at the level that's required. Another benefit is, and this is the common sense one, is that having shared metrics enables you to track progress toward a shared goal. You all agree on what the metrics are, you're all looking at them together. That also helps enable coordination and collaboration because you've all got this set of 15 metrics in front of you, and you can think about, okay, what can I do that will help move that? What can this other organization do that can help affect that? Learning and course correction, this is one I talk about a lot. I feel is really important because ultimately the goal is not just about accountability, but about in order to do things better, you need to have a pretty good view of what's actually happening, and the data is what gives you that, and the data gives you feedback on what the initiative is doing. Has it worked? Has it not worked? How can we learn more about what's making it work or not work? And then creating urgency and catalyzing action. A lot of times you find things in the data that are pretty surprising or that are unacceptable, and you can use that to go to the community, to go to policymakers and say, look, this is, we need to change this. The idea here is, and this gets to the continuous improvement piece really, the shared measurement provides a common language to drive continuous learning. So you start by learning from each other, you're sharing best practices through this common language of results. That leads to refinements in the individual and collective work. And then you test that work gets tested, and you measure what it's done, and you share the results of that among the group, and you kind of go, continuously go around trying things out, seeing if they work, looking at them, learning from them, trying other things out. So again, pretty standard continuous improvement process, but the idea is that shared metrics are essential to make that happen. Some tactical things here to get down from the elevated theoretical level. What are the steps for doing this? In the design phase, so when you're first setting it up, you want to think about the shared vision for the system. You want everybody to contribute and say, what should this look like? You want to set criteria for metrics. Should it, again, is it cheap? Is it frequent? Is it, what does it give it as a view? Oftentimes when we take folks through this process, before we get to the metrics, we're getting to agreement about what kind of metrics should we have, and that's really about the criteria. You want a governance process and working groups where the shared metrics, the working groups will have their own set of metrics, and so you need to have a relationship between, okay, what are the working groups metrics? How do they relate to the overall efforts metrics? So there needs to be some thought given to that. You look at the available metrics. You see what's already being collected, what's already being put out there. I mean, in many, many cases at this point, lots of organizations and lots of government agencies are putting out data, are looking at issues. So you want to see, can you use stuff that's already out there? Of the things that are already out there, what's valuable? What do you want to adopt? What might you need to change? And then finally, once you've gotten the metrics selected, you want to take them out to stakeholders and say, okay, this is our first pass at this as a steering committee, but what do you think? Do these seem like the right set of things? Are there critical things missing? Are there things that you take out that you don't think are important? So there's an engagement process before you finalize that set of shared metrics. This is more on the learning piece. So how do you use shared measurement to enable that collaboration? and continuous improvement. And so you do need teams. A lot of times that's the working groups. Those groups have to review the data, so you have to make time to review the data. You have to make the space to discuss the challenges and successes of work. Sounds easier to say than to do, right? Because what you find is very often people are working in the community, it's often their work that's showing up in the data. How do you get people comfortable talking about what's not going well? Feeling like they're not going to be judged, there's an element of trust and of safety where you can say, yeah, we tried this, it didn't work, how can we fix it? Rather than trying to say, yeah, I don't really want to share that data, I'd rather we not look at that metric because it's going to make me, my organization, or my neighborhood look bad. Assuming you can get to that point where people can freely talk about data, how do you use it to identify the areas for improvement? How do you think about testing those changes? I think this is all fuzzier than it is on paper. But the idea is you do make changes, you try to figure out how to see if they're making a difference. And then if they work, great, you can implement those more broadly and kind of propagate them throughout the initiative. So again, this looks a lot like a lot of other improvement processes. But I think some of the softer things are the critical ones. So that people feeling like they can share data, people feeling comfortable in talking about data and digging into data rather than it being a public relations exercise. Some challenges that we often see with shared measurement, difficulty in agreeing on what indicators matter. Depending on what your perspective and where you work, different things have very different importance. And so getting people to agree on a set of 15 or 20 indicators can be difficult. Concerns about how you're going to look once these data are being collected and being shared and being talked about. I think a lot of times organizations aren't super excited about that process. I work a lot with school districts, and school districts are beat over the head all the time by the media on their data, sometimes justifiably, but still that creates a reluctance to use data for learning and creates a kind of like, if we don't have to deal with data, let's not. Or if we don't have to share data, let's not. So we sometimes have to overcome that. Limited capacity for measurement and data analysis. And some of that's time, but I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which it's the skill, the ability to not just collect data, but be able to make meaning out of it and turn it into something that's useful for decision making. Getting funders to align for the common measures as part of their reporting requirements. So instead of it being yet another form of reporting in addition to all of the forms of reporting that organizations are already required to do, can you get funders, can you get government agencies to agree that maybe some of these common measures can serve in place of some of the things organizations were previously being asked to do. And then finally, just the time and cost of developing and maintaining this data management function. Within the backbone, it's usually a half of a person or a person. There's sometimes some kind of IT system. So there's a resource cost to doing this that has to be sustained. And I think here more than anywhere else, sustaining it is critical because you want that data year over year over year over year. You want it to be consistent so that you can see if changes are happening. So if there are big gaps or if it doesn't get collected one year or if it doesn't, there are real, you can get really set back by this not being sustained over time. Some things that we've seen that have helped initiatives overcome those challenges, having strong support from funders, but also having funders who are willing to not get over-involved in what those indicators are. So funders, in general, we think funders should be a partner at the table on the steering committee, part of the process, but you don't necessarily want the funders to be saying, these should be the indicators, because then you don't have broad buy-in, people aren't as willing to agree to those shared metrics. A broad engagement process, so again, vetting, when you have those initial shared metrics, vetting them, making sure you're getting feedback, and allowing any organizations that are interested in using them to use them. Infrastructure, so you do, figuring out how to provide that sustainable resource for the data management. And then finally, getting feedback on whether it's working. So in addition to the feedback that the data is providing, getting a sense from folks, does this process work? Do these metrics work for us? Are we getting what we need? Some little rules of thumb we found helpful. The top level indicators, I keep using 15 to 20, and we really think it ought to be 15 to 20, because any more than that, it just gets incredibly unwieldy. You don't want 50 indicators. It doesn't really help you navigate. On the other hand, you probably don't want 3. You know, you want to be able to track a reasonably broad set of criteria across different pieces of the strategies, and so you end up with somewhere between 10 and 20 generally. And as you're doing that, it's important that the process works very well if you, before you choose the indicators, choose the criteria by which you're going to choose the indicators. Reporting progress regularly is a very good practice. So some kind of annual report, start with the baseline, and then year 1, okay, here's where we are. Year 2, here's where we are. Thinking about ways to communicate the numbers, and we talked about this in the last session, in ways that people can relate to it. So percentages are great. You know, a lot of it, you know, we went up by 10%, but I think sometimes using numbers, like 500 more kids took the PSAT, you know, 300 fewer admissions for, you know, asthma, ways to make it more tangible to people who aren't necessarily every day thinking about this issue, or who aren't necessarily, you know, thinking at a systemic level. Those numbers can be really helpful. And that's just one example, I think, of the general principle of trying to make it more vivid and concrete to people, what's happening. It's helpful sometimes to have local data experts, so if there are organizations that have strong data capacity, to get them involved and to have we've seen some initiatives with a little bit of almost a working group on data that advises on this and thinks about it as it evolves. Doing an inventory of what people are already measuring. Maybe these shared metrics can, you know, maybe some of them can be things that are already being measured, that people are already holding themselves accountable to. And of course, to the extent that there are existing indicators that are being collected, that are public, you know, try to use as much of that as possible. In general, I think we find that doesn't get you everything you need, but it certainly reduces the overall cost and burden of shared measurement to have some amount of those metrics being collected by the state or the local government.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by top level indicators?
So top level indicators are those indicators at the steering committee level. So the working groups also have indicators on their strategies, but the top level ones are the ones that are the 15 or 20 that the whole initiative says these are the key metrics that we're going to track and that we're going to report out on.
So do you suggest like additional indicators?
No, not at that level, but the idea is there are additional indicators. At the working group level, the working groups will probably have more that they're looking at, but not all of those flow up. Because the working groups are also, you know, they're diving more deeply into a particular part of the issue, so they'll probably be wanting to look at things. But you don't, if you float it all, if you have 4 working groups and they're each looking at 12 metrics, then all of a sudden you've got 48 metrics, which is way, way too many. So usually the top level indicators are a subset of those working group indicators.
Okay.
This is just an example to try to make this more real. This is from Magnolia Place, which is a neighborhood level effort in LA, and just an example of a dashboard for their initiative. And so you can see at the top here are these long-term outcomes. You can't read it, but it says developmental progress of children entering kindergarten. They've got 5 different areas here: communication, physical, language, and cognitive, social engagement, emotional maturity. Then they've got a top level indicator here on percent of 3rd grade children who are proficient in reading, obviously very critical. Percent of parents with children 0 to 5 with protective factors, percent of parents achieving family goals. And then these are more granular, where they break it down into particular real-time improvement in the services and supports that are seen as leading to changes in these.
Can you give us an example of one of those? Just
I can. So this is percent of, if I get real close. Percent of parents reporting positive relationship with child. Percent of parents, I can't read that one at all. Percent of parents, some of these I think are healthcare related.
Okay.
There's,
Is percent of parents reading to their child
There you go.
daily?
okay.
Should have just said you're welcome to come up here and read to the group.
It's a little challenging, but I think, the idea is that these are kind of a little bit more process,
Okay.
and they lead to these more outcome level indicators. And there are some interesting things that they've learned from their work. So let's stop and talk about real time. I think there are trade-offs in these metrics between inexpensive and public versus frequent. And so you want some indicators that are refreshed pretty frequently. You want others that maybe, you only get once a year and that's okay. But the closer you can get to real-time data, the better. Because you can do something and then see if it has an effect and then feed that. Just the faster your feedback loops are, the closer you can get to that. And then the reality is, a lot of data you're not going to get more than once a year. I mean, that's just the way things work in a lot of things. But there's also data, if you possibly can, try to get it more frequently. Some kind of structure for learning, and we've seen a lot of different ones of these. People use Strive uses Six Sigma. There's Carnegie Foundation is put out a model for improvement. Like, there's lots of different ways to think about continuous improvement. And it doesn't really matter, I think, which one people use, as long as there's some kind of structured approach to, okay, how do we get data? This is another one right here, the act, plan, do, study. We see that a lot. There's some kind of method to using and integrating data into decision making. The data can really create motivation and engagement for change, and it really, Magnolia Place at least has found that it really helps with strategic alignment to be looking at this dashboard, everybody looking at this dashboard together, and thinking about what to do. So I'll stop there again, because then what I'm going to go now is more to evaluation of not the outcomes of collective impact, but of a collective impact initiative. And so I just, if there are any questions or comments or thoughts or things you're seeing, yeah.
I don't want to call them a non-partner, but someone who isn't necessarily a part of your network, someone who doesn't come to meetings or is willing to share their data. So, that's definitely anybody who says, okay, well, I'm not necessarily willing to share responsibilities or whatever, but I'll give you my data.
Yeah.
So, it's within the structure to be able to pull those type of people in and just use that information.
Absolutely, yeah.
How does that get reported? How is that acknowledged?
That can vary, but so for instance, in a lot of the education collective impact efforts I've seen, not every district, for instance, is at the table at the steering committee. Not every district wants to be on the working group. However, it's really helpful to have data from every district, just so you can, there are kids who are affected by the work who are maybe not in a district that's participating, but you want to know what's happening. So I think there is really quite a bit of value, even if a stakeholder doesn't want to participate actively. Just contributing data is really helpful, because you want that complete picture of whatever the geographic region you're working in is. Otherwise, you're kind of, it's harder to know what's happening. So I think that is great. Even better if they then want to, get more involved. But
like here in our community with the Fort Bliss, sometimes it's easier for them to give us information rather than to actually participate, especially when people change out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would think that's great. I think it is. I've seen efforts where there is key data missing because people don't want to provide it, and it handicaps you. You just feel like you don't have quite what you need to tell what's going on. So, any other questions? All right. keep going. This won't go on forever. We do have some more interactive pieces. But I just wanted to kind of download, and then we can have, we've got some exercise where you can think about this and think about your effort. This is relatively new thinking for us. Think about the difference between shared measurement, which is really about the what is happening, what change is happening, and evaluating collective impact, which is a little bit of a deeper level about how and why that change is happening and how the effort itself is going. So, I really think the easiest way to explain it is to say shared measurement is about what's happening, and evaluation of collective impact is about how do we know if the collective impact initiative is what is working or not working and why. And so shared measurement systems are a subset of that. But evaluation of a collective impact initiative is really getting at a broader set of questions about whatever's going on in here, what's going on in the initiative that's underlying that. So the evaluation of a collective impact initiative is seeking to understand how a shared measurement system is being designed and implemented, how it's being used to learn, how those relationships are being formed. And so it is, as I said, a broader set of questions. Evaluating collective impact also requires a mindset shift, in addition to doing collective impact. And so that, again, this is similar to what we say about collective impact in general. The common approach to program evaluation, you're trying to isolate the direct impact of a specific intervention. You're trying to prove whether or not a specific intervention works. So you've got, ideally you have a control group and a treatment group, and you're trying to show that there was, you don't often get the chance to really do that, but that would be the ideal, right? And then you're detached. So the evaluation is detached from the ongoing activities. It's a third party. They're coming in from outside. They're taking an objective look. What we find in collective impact is, and evaluating whether it's working, is it's more focused on understanding how multiple organizations are working together, how that infrastructure is developing, how that web of relationships is thickening or not. It's looking at the improving. So how is the initiative focused on continuous improvement, and is it actually improving? And then finally, we often find that the evaluation is embedded rather than external. So it's hard to tell what's going on in a collective impact initiative if you're not, to some extent, and it's hard to just come in from outside, look at it and see what's going on. You need to see the relationships. You need to see how people are interacting with each other. You need to see if there's collaboration happening. So it's somewhat different. Again, the evaluation of a collective impact initiative is looking at a broader set of issues. I won't even get into that, but there are different levels here, though. And so I think evaluating collective impact effort, one thing you can look at is the initiative itself. So does it have the 5 elements? Again, we don't want that to be dogma, but we found that that's helpful. And so if there's no backbone organization, well, that's important to know. If there's no shared measurement system, that's important to know, and you could probably say something about what the likely outcomes are from that. You can also look at what the capacity of the initiative is. How extensive is the data management function? Like, how much experience do those folks have? How much experience do the organizations have in managing data? Then you can look at the systems that are targeted by the initiative. So if you have an initiative focused on foster care, well, you can look at, are the systems that are responsible for that being changed? Are the funding flows changing? Are the policies changing? So you can see the effects on systems. It's not necessarily the same thing as better outcomes, but what you'd hope is that changing those systems will result in better outcomes, which is the third level, right? The ultimate outcomes. And that's really what the shared measurement system is looking at. So the shared measurement system is kind of here. The shared measurement system, however, doesn't measure these things. That's different. And then finally, and fairly important but hard to get at, what's the context? This is work that is often done before collective impact effort starts, looking at the culture and history of the community. Is there collaboration? What are the politics? What are the demographic conditions? What's the political context? So that's, if you were doing a full-on evaluation of a collective impact initiative and why it wasn't being effective, you'd certainly want to include those things. And that really comes out of kind of a notional theory of change here, right? You've got the design and implementation of collective impact itself, which leads to, over time, changes in systems and behavior, which ultimately leads to changes in the outcomes and changes in lives. And that's how you, from that, you get to this and this. I will skip that for now. But, and I don't know, we can go into this more. I mean, I included a lot of these because, if you are interested in the larger sense of how can you tell whether a collective impact initiative is going well outside of the long-term outcomes, there's a lot in here that we can use to talk about that. But I don't necessarily want to go through it all if we don't get to that, if that's not a burning question. So, let's skip this because I think I'd like to just. Yeah, so for those of you who weren't here for the last session, I think this is worth thinking about. So working in collective impact, there's a bunch of mindset shifts. One is going from technical to adaptive problem solving. There are still going to be problems where you want technical solutions, but collective impact is really about this adaptive approach where you're continuously learning, you're seeing what's changing in the environment, and you're adjusting your approach. And it's structured to allow that and facilitate that. No silver bullets, but silver buckshot. You're not doing this to find the one program that works and make everyone do it. You're doing this to create lots of changes in the community, create more relationships, encourage people to, have small innovations, and then try to spread that throughout the system organically. But even if it doesn't spread, you've got these changes going on, you've got these relationships being created, you're creating capacity in the community that can also help make change. So when the idea is all those small changes add up to large-scale progress, much more than one answer that's rolled out across the whole community. And then finally, moving from credit to credibility. And this is more of a tension that I think will never go away in the work. Everybody will always have accountability, everybody will always have funders, everybody will always have government agencies, everybody will always need to report out on what they're doing and show, at an individual organization level and at a program level, okay, is it working or isn't it? The idea is to try to shift that somewhat to be more of a focus on some collective accountabilities, and also more of a focus on learning and more of a focus on collaboration on how are we doing as a community and as a set of stakeholders rather than just how did I do, how did my program do. As a group, how are we making change on this issue? You're never going to get all the way over to how is the community doing and nobody cares about how individual programs or organizations did. But in order to do this work well, I think you do have to try to move it in that direction and have some success in moving it more towards, yes, the accountability for individual organizations and programs is important, but it's also important to be thinking about how we're working together and how we're making progress as a collaborative. So some things that happen that we don't highlight as necessarily intentional going in, but things that really we think do happen and help create some of the impact once you've got it up and running is this relationship and trust building, which creates all kinds of things that go beyond the steering committee meetings or the working group meetings. What you find is the people are working together, they're talking about common issues, they're engaged, and all sorts of stuff happens and all sorts of conversation happen once you've opened up those channels and people trust each other and they're talking about what they're seeing in their sphere, and you're building again this notion of civic infrastructure in a community that quite honestly can then be repurposed for other issues. So it doesn't even have to be used for the issue that the original collective impact effort focused on. It's a great venue for leadership identification and development. Essentially all these working groups, all these different kinds of collaboratives that are going on, you're getting people involved who are not necessarily the top decision maker in the organization, who may be 2 or 3 levels down, and you're giving them an opportunity to connect with other folks in the community. You're giving them an opportunity to think big picture about what can be done and to really shape some of the solutions. So it does tend to identify leaders and to help those folks develop who aren't necessarily already running things. You want to be creating that culture of learning in the community, of using data and using information to think about what can we actually change. I think fostering connections between people is really similar to this relationship and trust building. You're making connections between organizations and partners that may not have had them before. And then finally, the way we hope that these things get structured is that there are quick wins, there is momentum, and what you hope that sparks is that in many of these communities where we've seen these efforts, there have been a lot of initiatives, there have been a lot of collaboratives. It's not like these problems have never been attacked before, and there hasn't necessarily been a lot of progress. And so if you can get some momentum going, if you can get people working in a different way, if you can get people starting to feel like, oh, this one will actually work, and that can actually create momentum so that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's important to think about quick wins, but it's also important to be communicating about why this particular kind of effort is hopefully going to be more successful than maybe some others that have come and gone. So that can be quite powerful if you get it going. Not that one always does. Sometimes one has to work through quite a bit of cynicism, and that's part of the work too. So also, before we get to the exercises and more of the discussion, wanted to make sure you knew about the Collective Impact Forum, which if you're doing this work, you can just sign up, and it's essentially a learning community. So there's lots of resources on there, but there's also a lot of people, there are about 6,500 people on there now who are doing this work, asking each other questions. It's not all mediated through us. I mean, we're hosting it, but really people are talking to each other about what they're seeing in their communities and what they're learning. So, and it's all free, and it will, I think, continue to grow, and there'll continue to be new resources added. So a good, hopefully, resource for the field. And then that's our contact information. But, so, happy to, talk about these, and then we do have some exercises for you to think about and for us to talk about. But any questions or comments that came up for you from this this material?
Hi.
Yeah.
I think as a backbone organization and the skills that you have to have, when you start to put the data up front, you have to be very careful on not to, with the working groups, not to feel one or two of them, if they're not getting the results that we want to have, sometimes it can be seen as this work group is not doing their job, and it's not like a collaborative work. Sometimes it's really hard because of the system or, I don't know, education.
Some work groups have harder problems to solve than others.
So you have to mediate, and it's not just shared evaluation, but also shared responsibilities on how do we support this work group deal with these issues that are harder than the other work group.
Sure.
So have you an example of something? Because then the work groups will not want to share the data anymore because they're putting them in the spot,
Yeah, that hasn't come up in things I've seen because the work groups are often not publicly, they're not, they're kind of reporting up to the steering committee, but it's not as if everybody's gathered together and work group 1 presents and work group 2 presents. And I guess you could see it in the data over time, but I don't know. And I think my sense is that people know that some of the work groups and some of the strategies are more challenging than others. So, for instance, if you have one work group that's focused on a curriculum change within the high schools, and you have another that's focused on parent engagement and getting if you have the right people in the room, you can probably make a curriculum change in the high school. Not that it's always easy, but you've kind of, there's a certain system. The system, it's a bit of a tailwind there. Whereas parent engagement's just always hard, right? Because parents are working and so I think in many of these efforts, people know that some of these things are going to be more challenging than others, and you're likely to see slower progress just because of the nature of that strategy. So a lot of times you see strategies that are very within the system, and then you see in the similar, but in the same initiative, you've got some strategies that are more, community focused or more, and those I think just move at different paces. But I think the backbone can support those differently, and so it may be that one work group needs more support from the backbone than another, and it makes sense for the backbone to do that, right? So. Pretty quiet. It's a lunch, yeah. Well, why don't we do something that'll, get folks kind of engaged. We've got some things for you to think about your work, and I'll let Agnes talk about that.
Sure. Do the shared measurement exercise?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No. You took a break. You've been talking for a while. So on your tables, you'll see an exercise named Data and Indicators and Collective Impact. And since this theme of shared measurement is just really compelling, this is an exercise that we've used with groups to think about what are the indicators that you're currently measuring, that are currently existing, or that you think that you might need to start to collect. What are the different purposes that you could use that data for? So as Jeff was talking about, thinking about like criteria for your shared measurement system. Is this data that you want to use to compel a change and make a case for change, or to track progress, or for other purposes as well, is important to think about. So we wanted to spend the next about 40 minutes in this discussion. And the basic elements are, one, thinking about your individual initiatives. What are some common metrics, and maybe you can think of the top, 5 metrics that you're currently thinking about or you've already identified, and are you using them, for what purpose are you using them? To make that case for change, to help demonstrate progress, or to help inform the work that you're doing? And then another thing to think about is that for the data that you're already collecting, what challenges have you faced, and what are some potential new ways to think about data collection and data approaches in the work? And then thinking about, of these indicators, how have you used them, which is basically, that very first question. And so there's a little bit of a sort of a matrix for you to think about filling out as part of the discussion. So we wanted to spend maybe perhaps the next 20 minutes in small group discussions at each table. You should join a new table to have these discussions around your metrics, and thinking about prioritizing them and the challenges you faced. And then we'll break and have a whole group discussion and debrief, and maybe share some lessons learned from different work that different initiatives have been working on.
Yeah, so take about 10 minutes to think about it.
Yeah.
And then 20 minutes to talk about it in the tables, and then we'll talk about it all together. And see what emerges. We'll have a little break.
A little break, yeah. Feel free to get up, move around.
Yeah.
Why don't we reconvene as a group and share some of the assessments that we conducted in our individual tables? I'm sure everybody said that you're strong on all elements, because I know these are all very, very strong backbone organizations in this room, right? All right, so why don't we talk about some of these pieces individually? And maybe perhaps folks can offer a perspective from the initiatives that they're working on. What are the areas that you felt that you were particularly strong at this phase of the work? And what were some areas where you felt that you needed significant investment moving forward? And
maybe I'll start here. Sharing about, who are the stakeholders, what are the expectations of the OA, bringing in new stakeholders who have not been at the table, or new potential grantees that have, for whatever reason, not presented a proposal, albeit we know they're good organizations doing good work.
have you, understanding that you're very early in the process, have you started to pull together a common agenda that is informing who needs to be at the table?
We have our perceptions, but certainly there's a history behind this. So there's an existing steering committee, there is existing media and promotion and messaging and a strategic plan. So we're coming into this midstream. So we want to be respectful of the groundwork that's already been laid, but also push a little bit as an OA, saying, here's what we see in the community, here's what our other partners are doing. We've been around for a while, we work in multiple different arenas. So we want to be able to kind of coalesce at least on the community level with the foundation's vision.
It's really interesting. Other perspectives?
We're in a little more unique position, and we are also a new OA organization. We're a new initiative that has never had an OA.
Oh, wow.
So we've got both the unique challenges of being new and the unique challenges of having, just starting a 1 year, working on a 1 year initiative, 1 year into the initiative.
And we don't have stuff.
And we have I thought we had the person, but yeah, not so much.
Any elements of the questions that we talked about that you feel there's been some investment that you can leverage?
Is
even
there a
this
funder
early?
willing to fund the creation of that in particular?
You got that?
Yes.
That's great. That's great. Definitely a good place to
I
start.
think we certainly have some language. So like number 2, explicit like in terms of a common agenda, like there's a definition for disconnected youth. There's a positive youth development approach that we're using that people are, the language is starting to come to grantees a little bit more frequently than obviously 12 months ago.
Great. That's great progress. So let me ask this to you. How did you feel about the work that's been done so far? Areas of particular strength or areas where you'd like more significant investment?
So we have been working a small amount of time also, but I think we're in the first 2 points, like the common agenda and the backbone support. I think we're more towards the strong situation. But since we just started Tuesday, like the activities, so the rest of the we have ideas, but they're still a work in progress. So so we're more towards the significant investment needed.
Okay. Well, I mean,
I'm not gonna say something. It's this process with us, with the Alcohol Control Initiative has been interesting because view from a organizing agency, the CEO, and the view from the staff
that would be neat.
are two different things. And a lot of times they are. And I think that's a uniqueness of an organizing agency that is not completely thrown into the whole health of that all. And that, there's some, Holly is very optimistic, very positive. I said, maybe not so much.
Okay.
And there's some balance there to help us be realistic.
It's a healthy tension.
It is, and it's a respectful tension most times. It is. I mean, from choosing people of cohort. God, she about killed me.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's healthy, but there's some different ideas coming in when you're an organizing agency and you're really outside the realm somewhat of the staff and their experience.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's sort of one thing to understand about this all is, as Jeff was talking about the timeline for collective impact, this is work that takes anywhere from 6 to 18 months to get a common agenda defined and, reinforcing work groups set up. We're constantly telling ourselves, because we are so used to working at really fast timelines, that this takes time.
It does.
Can I interject? Because
You have some common language?
well, we can't use that right now. No, but I'm really curious because this, you're talking about staff and the perspective from leadership to someone more on the ground.
Right.
And explaining these positions is really complicated.
It is.
And you have to I'm sure all of you have felt this at some point when you're trying to hire for these organizing agents. You have to do this. Yeah, you're on the 3.
Thanks for sharing. Thanks.
3 times it's a charge.
Okay.
is the healthy one.
But I'm curious to know, I mean, and maybe you can provide some, you can be our flashlight, in terms of, you know, what should we be looking for? You know, certainly Deb and I we've interviewed, we're still considering people, we know what we don't want. We met that person, they flew back home.
Can I take this one?
I mean, like,
This is what you want.
but I think it eventually Nora's not gonna be in this position. It's a skill set and it's a mind frame.
You have to threaten just the right way.
No. You know, it can't be about the person. It has to be about the qualities and the characteristics. And you all have seen this. And I'm telling Deb here, like, don't compare ourselves to what Smoke Free is doing or alcohol is doing or tuition.
No.
Like, all of these initiatives, the way that the essence of our work is the same, but the way it gets implemented is going to look very, very different. And I think you guys, all of you as OAs, would spin your wheels in the mud if you started to say, well, look what Smoke Free's doing and we have to do it that way. We can't make that comparison.
So, I guess, I mean, one question is, which function are you trying to, is the executive director one, or which?
No, she's
Oh,
the
she's the,
executive
oh,
director.
well, so which position are you looking to fill? Because I
The
think.
coordinator, the lead person in the backbone organization.
So like we're looking for a Holly, we're looking for a Nora, we're looking for a Lucy.
Because I think it depends.
No.
I mean, it is,
Yeah.
you can certainly say, I think, certain qualities, like you want somebody who is able to deal with ambiguity, right? You want, because this is an adaptive,
Good way to put it.
this is an adaptive process. And so somebody, there are people who like to know what's going to happen.
So when I said we live in a gray world, that wasn't enough?
I think we need to word that, and I don't think we need to add the word ambiguity to that.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the people who want, clear timelines that are not gonna move, where you know exactly what you're doing, this is not necessarily the best kind of work for them. So, that's one thing. And, and I think people who are, you do want people who are oriented toward learning, who are oriented toward looking at, no matter where you are in a backbone organization, I think you want to be comfortable. I mean, well, you want to be comfortable building relationships, certainly, and being able to, do that, but also look at data and also think about what data means. So be inclined to being analytical in that way. And so I think that's helpful. But I think that, aside from those characteristics that are useful no matter what role you're in or what issue, I think that it depends on, the other piece depends on what you're going to be doing, right? So do you need somebody who's more of a data person, or do you need somebody who's more going to be, you're going to do more facilitation, you have the data outsourced. Like, it depends on on sort of what the skill set is of the person or people already in the organization, as well as what the work is for the next, months or year.
Yeah, we're looking at policy changes. Whole different ballgame.
Right.
Than creating a program.
Right.
Or doing, Deb, I don't know what you have, so I can't say, but we're looking at policy changes, and how you do that is a whole lot different. I mean, did we look at Smoke Free and see kind of, look a little bit like that, but we know where ours is completely different. So we have to go in that mind that ours is so different that if we model it against Smoke Free, we're gonna fail.
Yeah.
Miserable. So it's what changes, what are your goals, and then you gotta look at that person can meet those goals.
Well, and one of the things that I'm struggling with, as, kind of your position, Bill, is I don't know what I don't know. Since,
Oh, yeah.
There's never been an organizing agency for this initiative. We've never been an organizing agency, so, it's really kind of hard, because I honestly don't know what I don't know.
What are y'all doing different?
Ignite, Connected Youth.
Okay.
I think it's also important, like, just because because there is so much ambiguity, that sometimes in addition to the skill set, it's the people side is really important. And if you find the person that's the right fit for your initiative and your agency, and that can be tough to do, you know, to
And
find.
that was interesting, because
Then I really think the skill sets,
the ideal paper candidate
right, it's not
would
the.
never have worked in our
So,
organization.
to me, almost the people side is equally as important as the skill side, because you can supplement the skill side, and we just saw like all those different roles, you know, there's those 3 different roles, and, you know, yeah, no, but none of us are in the luxury yet, well, Smoke Free, because you've been around longer, has more staff, because you do more things, but the other ones, you know, it's like Karen's the one in Juarez, and I'm the one here, and so, you know, we sort of fulfill those 3 roles, and then sometimes people from the Y, you know, that we get some assistance from, like, I don't have any IT background at all, so, you know, the YMCA, I get support from the Y too, but if there's pieces I'm missing and I'm a good fit with the initiative, I'm pretty confident that they're gonna say, you know what, okay, we're happy with Holly in that role, but this is something we really need in the backbone support role, and she doesn't have that skill, so how can we fill that in with, you know, either another position at the Y or another position with the something. So to me, it's almost more important that you find that right mix that says, okay, I'm good here in this environment with the OA and the foundation and the initiative, and then fill in the gaps as you discover what they are, because that's part of the ambiguity.
I think all of those things are really important. I think that what Jeff said about kind of some of the roles or tasks. So for example, not everyone is good at policy efforts. We were blessed to find Annette who's great at them, and Nora with an MBA and different skill sets, and the face of Smoke Free. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I think, at least from my experience, is critically important in this role is passion.
That's right.
That
For that area.
these individuals who have worked with us are there Saturdays, they're making me run some sort of glow-tastic event, I don't know what that is, but I'm doing it, to support the initiative. They are constantly out there on weekends and evenings and saying, hey, we've gotta be at Neon Desert, or hey, we've gotta do this to trumpet what we've got, and so a lot of those answers I think are critically important, but passion is vital.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I'll ask Smoke Free, since everyone's talking about you guys.
They're talking about us like we're not here.
You know? But as you went through the assessment, you know, and you ticked off all the things that you're strong at, you know, what were the areas that you thought, even though you are a much more sort of mature initiative, that you still need significant investment in?
Oh, there's several of them, Agnes. There's and in that, and we're not expecting any tears. But you know, we have been taking, thanks to Michael, 14 years ago, a coordinated and comprehensive approach to tobacco control, and back then, I swear he was the only one thinking it on the planet, because everyone was doing cessation research. Let's get people to quit smoking. And the realization or the reality that you had to get people to quit smoking, get youth to not start smoking, have media that gets messaging out broadly that talks about policy and taxes and those kinds of issues. It was so visionary and novel. And so we've been doing that, thanks to that, for a long period of time. But as I said to Michael and Janet today, and the Smoke Free team, this kind of asks you to raise the bar exponentially and gives you some methodological tasks and ways to do that. And so there were several that we thought, you know, we could really significantly improve upon. For example, one of the really interesting discussions we had are stakeholder results getting shared across the network and across the group as well as externally. And you know, sometimes we do the external portion really well in terms of the scientific community or even the region. And sometimes, even though we're announcing headlines of the network meetings or whatnot, folks aren't there. Are we getting the word out reliably? Are we having sharing meetings where network members who maybe aren't funded, who are grantees, are able to also engage at high levels of the discussion? So there's a lot of things today that we picked up on that that are gonna enhance the quality of our efforts.
I'm definitely happy to hear that, and I see that sort of in the realm of continuous communication and how communication can be such a strategic tool for deepening the impact that you have. And now that's great that you're thinking in that way, and I think that's what's so powerful about the model. It gives you at least a framework to think about these things that can hopefully change lives and communities, and enhance the great work that's already going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll ask the last table on healthy eating and active living.
What, the specific question of what we,
As you went through the assessment, what are some areas that you felt that you are particularly strong in, or areas that you felt that you needed significant investment?
well, for me, I think one area that we were strong was in terms of having a agreed upon language. We were doing well there. I think, we're relatively young, and so, having a common agenda and having different stakeholders on board and driving the process is an area where we could probably improve. I mean, we have a definite structure, but to me, it doesn't match the structure that you guys are recommending. So, that's something to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, this is, one model to think about this work, and, we're very careful about being really prescriptive about it. And I think that as you think about, your steering committees and your working groups, I mean, having this iterative process, having sort of an opportunity to guide the vision and provide leadership, sort of a space for work to happen, I mean, that could take different forms. It doesn't have to be as prescriptive as this model. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we're almost at the end of our time. Well, we're actually over. But, thank you all. I mean, I think this was hopefully a very a valuable discussion in terms of thinking about how the model of collective impact could help deepen and enhance the work that's already going on, how there's some frameworks and tools and methodologies for you to think about all these components around the 5 elements, as well as, places that you can go to for help that are actually out there, and definitely count Jeff and myself as resources to you all. But thank you so much for just spending time with us today. We really appreciate it and applaud the great work that you all are doing so far. Yeah.